well, we are going to be covering the timeline, and let me get my control panel out of the way so I can see my screen here. All right, so the accordance timeline is very similar to the accordance atlas. There are a lot of sort of parallel features, and we'll see some of those. And I'm beginning with the Bible text because I want to show you how you can interact with the timeline from the text of the Bible, how you can amplify to the timeline. So here, I'm just in 1 Samuel 17 and reading about David. I want to locate David in time. So I can go to the timeline by selecting David and then going to the Amplify menu and going down and choosing timeline. Or in my case, I like to have access to the atlas and the timeline right in my toolbar. So if you'd like access to the timeline right from the toolbar as well, you can control or right-click on the toolbar and then go to Customize Toolbar. And then you'll see the timeline icon there, and you can just drag it into your toolbar. And when you're done customizing your toolbar, just click Done. And now you've got the timeline item right there in the toolbar. And so I like that because then I don't have to go through the Amplify menu. I can just select David, click Timeline, and I'll get the timeline with a single click. Okay, so again, just to repeat that, that's to customize your toolbar. Control or right-click on the toolbar, and then choose Customize Toolbar. And then drag whatever you want into the toolbar, and you can customize to your heart's content. Okay? All right, so another way to access the timeline, in addition to amplifying to the timeline like we just did, is you can access the timeline from the info pane. So, when I'm working in the text, new feature of Accordance 11 is our info pane, which gives you access to commentaries that cover that verse, cross-references, and so on. And you'll see topics, you'll see people, and if you hover over David, it'll go to your default dictionary and so on. But down at the bottom, you'll also see an atlas link, which will link you to places that are mentioned, like Bethlehem, and a timeline link that will link you to important people in this particular passage. So I can just go down here and click on David under Timeline, and it'll open up the timeline for me. So be aware that access to the timeline is built right into the info pane. So you may just look right there as you're exploring the passage. All right, so now we've got the timeline here, and I'm going to just go ahead and close this so we can focus on the whole timeline. And the first thing I want you to see is that Accordance searched for every item on the timeline that has David in it. So here's David as a ruler, and your key is right up here at the top of the window. So this shows me that the blue items are rulers, the brown is prophets, green is individuals, yellow is writings, and red is events. And so it found David as a ruler. It found David as an individual. I'll explain the difference in just a moment. And then it found events that begin with the word David. Now, unfortunately, and I believe this is going to change in the next major upgrade to Accordance, the timeline only searches for words at the beginning of the description or label on the timeline. So it's not finding David's flight from Saul, David's census, and so on. It eventually will. We're going to fix that. But it'll still get you to most of the major items related to a person. All right, so now as you can see, I've got a 15-inch laptop screen here, and already at this point the text is pretty small. And we've got lots of different items on the timeline. And we can actually customize the number of items that appear so that it's not quite so overwhelming. I'll show you that in a minute too. But I also want to zoom out and show you not just the items within a particular region, but all of the different regions that are represented on the timeline. So here you can see as we zoom out, we start to see more than one region at a time. And so the timeline is divided up between different geographical regions so that you can compare, well, what's happening in Egypt at this particular time in biblical history, and what's happening in Syria and Mesopotamia and so on. So each region is sort of ordered in roughly contiguous order. So we have Egypt here down at the bottom, and then Israel, Palestine moving a little further north, then Aram, Syria, Mesopotamia, so now we're going east to Mesopotamia and Persia, and then we kind of have to go back to the west and we get Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey, Greece, and then Rome. And there's a world history timeline region that we haven't filled in with items yet. We're working on that for another upgrade to the timeline. But one of the things you'll notice about each of these regions is that each region is given a distinctive color. And when the people of one region dominate the people of another region, you'll see that region's color spill over onto the other regions. So here, if we look at the late Assyrian Empire, we see the blue of Mesopotamia spill over into Phoenicia and Aram, and then into Israel. Then you go a little further, you've got the Neo-Babylonian Empire. They actually into Elam, which is on the eastern end of Persia, and I'm sorry, the western end of Persia, to the east of Mesopotamia. And then they also take over the former Assyrian Empire and then conquer Judah as well. And then you see the Persian Empire actually goes into Egypt, loses Egypt for a while, and then regains Egypt. And then you have this really thin slice of orange, and the orange is for Greece, and that represents the empire of Alexander the Great, which of course was bigger than any previous empire, but didn't last very long. All right, so that's how the regions work. And so we've seen we have different regions on the timeline, and then within each region you have different kinds of items, like we talked about just a minute ago, rulers, individuals, events, and so on. Now, we can customize the look of the timeline using these two pop-ups here. Okay, both of them say all, which is really not very helpful in distinguishing the two pop-ups. So we're going to actually customize these to make them easier to distinguish. The first pop-up shows the regions that are displayed on the timeline. So right now we're displaying every region. The advantage of that is, of course, we can see, you know, all of these different regions. But the disadvantage that you may have when you're displaying all regions is, what if I want to compare Israel and Mesopotamia, or even Israel and Rome in the New Testament period? I want to compare what are the events happening in Israel in comparison to the events that are happening in the Roman Empire. And trying to compare things across 5 other regions is difficult. So what we can do is we can actually choose which regions that we want to display. For example, we can just choose one region, or we can do Israel and neighbors. That will show Egypt and Syria and Israel. Or we can customize it to show us other combinations like Israel and Mesopotamia. And so now let's zoom in on the late Assyrian and Babylonian periods. And you can see now I can compare, well, who are the Mesopotamian rulers? Who are the Assyrian kings or the Babylonian kings? And then
David,
compare that with, well, who are the Israelite kings at the time. Yes.
I don't know if you can do anything about this, but the font is so small that we really can't see it very well on this end, but I don't,
Right.
okay. I just thought I'd
I'm
let you
I'm
know.
I appreciate that. I'm getting there.
Okay, thanks.
uh, I'm wanting you to feel the pain, and then that way, when you experience the solution, you'll be that much more excited about it.
Okay.
All right. So we have these different regions that you can isolate. Let's customize the regions, and let me show you how to do that. To customize your region layers that are available to you, you just go into that pop-up menu and choose Define Region Layers. All right, and you'll get this dialog box here. And let's say that I want to create a layer that will compare Israel and Rome, just show Israel and Rome and nothing else. Now, I can click the New button, and then I can choose to give this particular region a name. I'm going to do Israel and Rome. And then I'm just going to check the items that I want to be displayed. So I'm going to uncheck Egypt, uncheck Aram, keep Israel checked, and check Rome. All right, and when I'm done, I'll click OK. And now I've just got Israel and Rome together, okay, with none of the intervening items. All right. So let's do one other thing here to help us out in the future. Go into Define Region Layers. And the fact that well, in fact, let me cancel out of this. The fact that we just named all regions all and then all items all was pretty short-sighted of us, because it doesn't really give you any way to distinguish these two pop-ups. So what I'm going to have you do is go into Define Region Layers and select the all region and just modify the name and call it all regions. And we're not going to change anything about that particular region. We're just going to change the name. And when I click OK, now I have all regions here in the menu. So if I want to go back to all regions, I can do that. And now I've got all of my regions again. Okay. All right. So now let's get to the problem Linda mentioned about we've got so much on the timeline right now. We're so far zoomed out we can't read anything. That's one of the problems with having every item displayed on the timeline. Is you've got so much information, you really have to zoom out to get the big picture. And then once you've zoomed out that far, it's hard to read things. So in this second pop-up, these let me choose the various items that are displayed on the timeline. So if I go to something like rulers, then you can see it's a lot easier to zoom in and see more than one region at a time. The fonts are showing up better. I don't have to zoom out as far because I'm only showing rulers. I'm not showing events and writings and everything else. Or we can do, prophets or individuals, books, and so on. All right, so you can simplify the timeline at any time by choosing the items that appear here. So I want to add some other items that show less than all, but more than just one individual type of item. Okay. So to do that, we're going to go into Define Item Layers. And the first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to change the name of the all set of items so that we've got another clue in our pop-up menu of what the difference is between the pop-ups. So I'm just going to do all items, and I'm just changing that name. I'll click OK. And now it's a little easier to distinguish, okay, there's where I set my regions, there's where I change the items. Okay, so if you all will do that, I think that will simplify your use of the timeline in the future. Help you to know which pop-up menu to go to. All right, so the other thing I want to do is add some more item layers. So go back to Define Item Layers. And this time I'm going to create a new layer. And notice what happens when I click the New button. I get rulers, profits, individuals, but they all show up as black. And I have to go in and customize the color and set the color of each item. I don't really want to hassle with that. So what I'm going to do is actually delete this new one that I created. And instead I'm going to go select the All Items layer, and I'm going to duplicate it. And that actually keeps all the colors and the shapes and everything just like I had in All Items. And I don't have to change anything. I can just check and uncheck the items that I want. So I'm going to give this the name Rulers, Individuals, and Events. If you're hearing the garbage truck on my street, I'm sorry about that. All right, so Rulers, Individuals, and Events, and then I'm just going to go down here and I'm going to uncheck Profits and Writings. Okay, and when I click OK, now I get kind of a happy medium that shows me most of the major items on the timeline that I'm interested in, the rulers, the individuals, the events, but it really condenses the timeline down a little bit, much more so than if I go into all items. And now I already have to start zooming out and everything gets smaller again. Okay, so you can create other combinations, you know, just rulers and individuals or rulers and events or whatever you want. But I find rulers, individuals, and events becomes a happy medium that is easy to work with. Okay? Any questions at this point? Is everybody understanding the, yeah.
David, did you have a question a while ago? David Woodworth?
No, I did a while ago, but I forgot that question because of my age. But I actually would like him just to do one more time how he set that last one up, because up until this point, I've sort of been with him.
Okay.
Okay.
Let's do another one.
Let's do another one.
Go to
define.
Linda, can you mute whoever needs to be muted?
I got it.
Okay, thanks. Go to Define Item Layers, and I'm going to go up again to All Items and just duplicate that. The only reason I do that is because it keeps my colors and I don't have to reset those. So select All Items and duplicate. It automatically gives it the name All Items.1. So I have to rename that layer. I'll call this Rulers and Events. Okay, and then I'm just going to go and I'm going to check rulers, uncheck profits, uncheck individuals, uncheck writings, and leave events checked. And now I've created a combination where I've just got the rulers and the events. Okay, does that make sense? So
Unmuted. Oh, thank you.
Sure thing.
Sure thing.
All right, so doing that enables you to kind of customize the timeline to show just the items that you want on the timeline. Now notice we have just rulers and events shown on the timeline, but we have this green bar here for the life of David. Why is that showing up? And this is actually David as an individual. Why is that showing up when I've said I don't want individuals, I just want rulers and events? The reason it's showing up is because I did a search for David. And so it has put those items on the timeline even if I choose to display nothing else. So if I go and I choose rulers, for example, and I say I just want rulers, you can see it changed the color of that particular layer, has rulers in red rather than blue. But it also keeps the events as well as David as an individual. So because those items were found by my search, it keeps those 3 events, even though the colors are all different in this particular layer. Okay, so just want you to understand, when you do a search, for example, if I do a search for another event, let's do a search for the Exodus. All right, now I've said I just want rulers displayed, but when I do a search, Exodus is not a ruler, it's an event, but it finds Exodus and puts it on the timeline. So accordance isn't thwarted by the decisions you make about what you want to show on the timeline. If you do a search, it's going to show you the results of the search no matter what. And that's kind of an extra item. It's analogous to extra place names on the atlas when you do a search on the atlas, for those of you who've attended that webinar. Okay? So regardless of what you choose, if you search for something that's not included in that set of items, you're still going to get it. All right, so let's now start to look at some of these items and look at the distinctions among them. First, what's the difference between David as a ruler and David as an individual? You can get more information about any item on the timeline simply by clicking its label. And at the top, you'll get this little text box that will give you the name of the item. It'll also give you any alternative names. For example, if we go to some of the Israelite kings, I'm trying to think. Yeah, here we go. Jehoash of Israel is also called Joash in some translations or some passages. And so it'll give you both of those names. It'll give you the main name and any alternative names. And then it will also give you the dates of the event and then the relevant scripture references. So I can click this and begin reading about Jehoash, and so on. So this is a way to get more information about any item that you click on. So let me click on David again, and we'll see his dates are 1011 to 971. Now this is the dates of his actual reign. And you can see the scripture references go from 2 Samuel 2, when David becomes king in Hebron, king of Judah, through 1 Kings 2, when David finally dies. If we go to David as an individual and click on that, the years of David's life, 1041 to 971. So this now includes the 30 years that David was alive prior to becoming king. And we can see now we get 1 Samuel 16 to 1 Kings 2 because we're first introduced to David in 1 Samuel 16. All right, so does that make sense to everybody?
Okay, there's a question. Can the timeline differentiate between good and bad kings of Israel and Judah, or can I do that myself with the timeline tool?
I think the answer is going to be no to both of those questions. No, it doesn't distinguish good and bad kings. And no, there's no way to sort of modify the information. What we'd almost need is some way to annotate an item and sort of add a note to a particular king so that you could, put in bad king or good king or something and have it show up. That's an interesting idea. I'll have to think about that. But no, at this point, you'd kind of have to go through and look at each of the scripture passages for each of these kings, and it very quickly tell you. Let's get something in modern English. Joram clung to the sins that Jeroboam, son of Nebat, had caused Israel to commit. So, bad king. Jeroboam II, we'd have to click again, and you'll get a description of his reign and so on. But But no, that there's nothing in the timeline that would give you that information. Now, another thing that you might look at, in addition to clicking on the actual scripture links and reading about them, is look up each of these people in a dictionary. And notice when I hover over Jeroboam II, I will get a link to the Bible Times Photo Museum, which gives me an article about Jeroboam II. Let me go ahead and click on this, double click on it, I'm sorry. And this will open up our Bible Times Photo Museum. Now this is sort of a tool that is still a work in progress, so it doesn't cover every item on the timeline yet, but our intention is to make it be to the timeline what the Bible Lands photo guide is to the atlas, a kind of perfect tool to link with the timeline that will give you information about each item on the timeline, as well as other items. The Photo Museum doesn't just cover timeline items, and then we'll also give you photographs and pictures. So here's this seal was discovered, and it says belonging to, I think it's the servant of, belonging to Shema, the servant of Jeroboam. So the inscription actually mentions Jeroboam. We're not quite sure whether that's Jeroboam the first or Jeroboam the second, but interesting artifact related to that particular king. Then the article talks about how Jeroboam the second presided over a period of great prosperity in Israel. And this is when some of the prophets were condemning the northern kingdom of Israel for its exploitation of the poor. And it was condemning, Samaritan women for lying on ivory beds. And this is not an ivory bed from Samaria, but it's an ivory bed from the island of Cyprus, and we can around the same period, and we can see an analogous artifact and so on. So anyway, if you're looking for quick information about an item, you could, and you have the photo museum, you could link that to your timeline. Or if you don't have the photo museum, you could link Anchor Bible Dictionary or whatever other Bible dictionary you have to the timeline and so on. To do that, to determine, well, what dictionary comes up when I hover over an item or double click on an item, go to the accordance menu and go to Preferences. And in Windows, where are the preferences, Linda? Are they under the Edit menu?
Yes.
Okay, so Edit menu, Preferences, or Accordance menu, Preferences, depending on whether you're on Mac or Windows. And then go down to Timeline Display, I think it is. And you can choose the default tool that will appear when you hover over an item or double click it. So I can choose any of my Bible dictionaries if I wanted to. The Photo Museum is unfortunately not complete. I've gone ahead and chosen that, but I know that's going to be kind of hit or miss depending on what item I hover over. If you wanted something more comprehensive, you might go to a full-blown Bible dictionary and use that. All right, and then you can set the default text that's used when you click on a scripture reference. So right now, instead of KJV, I can choose my default Bible and click OK. And now when I click on those scripture links, let's see, why didn't it update? It's still giving me the KJV. So I may need to, it may happen the next time I open the timeline. But it should happen from now on where it gives me the HCSB. All right, so any other questions?
No, I don't see any right now.
Okay. All right, so the other thing that you can do with any of these items is you can select them and amplify to any other resource. For example, Jeroboam II is covered in the photo museum. Jehu is not. You can see when I hover over it, I don't get any information. But I can always go to any other Bible dictionary in my Accordance library by selecting Jehu and then going to Amplify Dictionaries, and then I can choose my dictionary. Let's do something like the Holman Bible Dictionary. And so I'll get a brief dictionary article about that particular person. Or I can select Jehu and then choose a Bible text and search for this individual and so on. So you can go from the timeline to any resource in your library. You can go from any resource in your library to the timeline. That's the beauty of amplifying in Accordance. All right, so the other thing you'll notice about the timeline here is that when you get into the divided kingdom period, you can see that the Israel-Palestine region is actually split into two. So we actually have sub-regions within individual regions. Here, to distinguish between Phoenicia, which is on the Mediterranean coast of Syria, we have that here. And then we distinguish that from Aram, which is actually, the Damascus portion of Syria and so on. Phoenicia is actually mostly Lebanon, but some of Syria. All right, so so you've got distinctions between different regions within a region. You can have distinctions between Elam, Persia, and Media, and so on. When you get into Persia. All right, so we've looked at the difference between the life of David and the reign of, or I'm sorry, I'm backwards pointing. The reign of David. Let me zoom in a little bit. The reign of David, David as a ruler versus David as an individual. And then you have the events in David's life. Samuel anoints David, David made king in Hebron, David slays Goliath, and so on. Now, and again, we can click on any of those items and get the relevant scripture reference. So if I want to read about his conquest of Jerusalem, it's right there. If I want to read about his adultery with Bathsheba, it's right there. I can click to get that biblical text and so on. The other thing that we can do is we might ask ourselves, well, when did these events happen in the life of David? And just like on the atlas, you can option drag from one place to another to measure the distance between those places. You can option drag on the timeline to measure distances in time. So if I start at the beginning of David's life, let's zoom in here just to make it a little easier to see. So I'm going to start right here at the beginning of David's life. I'm going to hold down the Option key, or I believe it's the Alt key on Windows, and then click and drag to Samuel anoints David. You will see the number of years elapsed down here in the Instant Details box, and also up here in the top right-hand corner of the window. Okay, so if I go from David, the beginning of David's life, to Samuel anoints David, I get an age of about 11, 12 years. Okay, that's a little younger than I had always kind of imagined when I read 1 Samuel. I always assumed, that this happened right before David slew Goliath. But it looks like several years passed before that. And then Goliath comes when David is around 18, 19 years, 17, 18 years. So that sounds about right. That's I'll buy that. Then we go to David conquers Jerusalem, and we get an age of 36, 37 years. And of course, the adultery episode happens in Jerusalem, so it has to be after that. We get an age of 49, 50 years. So this particular episode in David's life, that David happened to be a lot older than I certainly ever imagined him being, and certainly older than Hollywood would ever depict David being if they were making a movie of David and Bathsheba. But here you've got a middle-aged man committing this adultery, which the first time I saw that, I thought, well, gosh, that puts a whole new spin on the story. Now it's not just young king who can have whatever he wants. It's a guy going through his midlife crisis. And when I started thinking along those lines, it brought to mind a passage where it's in the catalog of David's mighty men, and there's a story of David fighting the Philistines, and he gets tired, and he nearly gets killed by one of the Philistine champions, and one of his mighty men has to come to his rescue. And his men actually say to him, look, you can't keep coming out to battle with us because it's not right for the lamp of Israel to be extinguished in battle. And so his men actually tell him, you stay home. And there's no chronological data in that story, so there's no way to know whether that happened before or after Bathsheba. But if it happened before, then it may explain, David is at Jerusalem not because he's neglecting his duties, but because he's been told, you can't come out to battle with us. He's now feeling like less of a man, and he looks around for a way to restore his ego. Linda, do you have a question?
Yes, Michael has a question.
Okay.
Yeah, David, I missed. How did you get that line from David where you can drag it?
Just hold down the Option key on Mac or the Alt key on Windows and drag from one point to another.
I got it. Thank you.
You're welcome. All right, so these are the kinds of relationships in time that the timeline is really designed to enable us to see, so that we can begin to get some of the historical context to these biblical stories. So anyway, that's an example of how a timeline discovery can sort of change your view of what's happening in a passage or bring out aspects of the passage you may not have seen before. Now, that example leads us to an obvious question. Well, how do we know how old David was? Who came up with this 49 years old figure? And so now we're getting into the question of sources and what we use to develop the timeline. And when we first conceived of doing the timeline and talked to a few people about doing a timeline, we actually had some people say to us, you don't even want to go there. I wouldn't even do a timeline. And we'd say, what do you mean? And their response was, well, there are so many different scholars with so many different historical reconstructions and so many different theories about the chronology of the Bible that you're opening a big can of worms. People are going to be upset with you if you don't choose the right, chronology from their perspective and so on. And so, they said, don't do it at all. Well, we said, well, we don't want to not do something worthwhile just because it's a little controversial. So we said, well, what we'll do is we'll come up with two broad stroke representational chronologies. And what we came up with was the conservative versus the critical dating scheme. And we went round and round about these labels. We kind of joke if we wanted to offend everybody, we'd have called this fundamentalist and liberal or something like that. But the conservative dating scheme, what we mean by that term, and by the way, people aren't necessarily happy with these labels either. We have conservative scholars look at this and they say, well, that implies that we're not critical in our reconstructions. And critical scholars say, well, I'm actually very conservative in my date of this event or that event or whatever. So what we mean by these labels is that scholars who take a conservative approach to biblical chronology basically look at the chronological information in the Bible and take it at face value unless there's just overwhelming reason to question a figure that's given. So, for example, if we look at the Exodus, let me zoom out a little bit. If we look at the Exodus in the conservative dating scheme, and I click on it, I get a date of 1446 BC. And there's not even any slop built in there. It's a definite date of 1446 BC. The reason for that is because in 1 Kings, when Solomon is building the temple, it says that he built the temple some 430 years or 480 years. I don't remember the exact figure. I think it's 480 years after the Exodus from Egypt. And if we know when the temple was built, and we do, first temple constructed around between 966 to 959, but it was started in 966, then it's just a matter of simple arithmetic to arrive at the date of the Exodus. Now, the critical scholar would say, well, wait a minute, not so fast. You know, there may be reasons to question that date. For example, 480 years is a nice round number, and maybe that's supposed to represent, you know, a certain number of generations, a generation being 40 years or, you know, whatever, and they'll have their theories as well. And they would also say things like, well, you know, there are good reasons to question an early date of the Exodus. For example, one of those is that the Bible tells us that the Israelites built the store cities of Pithom and Ramses. Well, when was the first Ramses ruling in Egypt? And Ramses the first, we can scroll down to Egypt and look, doesn't appear until 1320. And then Ramses the second is even later. So you're talking about 150 years between the time that the Israelites built this city of Ramses and there are Egyptian pharaohs named Ramses. Now, you know, the conservative scholar would say, well, you know, maybe at the time that you know, Exodus was written, it used the name of the city that its current readers would know, which was Ramses, but maybe the city had a different name when the Israelites built that city, or maybe Ramses was a name that was attested, you know, it wasn't just a pharaoh's name, maybe it was a name, you know, that was in use in Egypt and so on. And, you know, the scholars, that's how scholars debate these kinds of things. But at any rate, the critical scholar would say, hey, you know, there are reasons to question chronological information in the Bible. Here are our reasons. Here are our reconstructions based on, you know, archaeology and this, that, and the other. And so what we've done is we've represented both schemes. If we have a date of 1446 in the conservative scheme for the Exodus, and then we have a definite Exodus and conquest period and a definite Judges period, watch what happens if I select Exodus and then switch to the critical dating scheme. Notice how everything shifts to the right and everything gets a lot fuzzier. And so instead of a definite Exodus and conquest and then a definite Judges period, you have Exodus, conquest, and Judges. And, you know, if the date of the Exodus is moved 100, let's see, the date is 1250, so 200 years later, then you've just compressed the conquest and Judges period. And, you know, then it becomes murkier trying to figure out, well, when's the beginning of the conquest, when does it end, and so on. And most people who follow this kind of reconstruction postulate that, there wasn't a big exodus, that there was sort of a series of migrations that, the Bible wrote about and sort of mythologized into this big exodus and so on. So anyway, we present you with both reconstructions so that you can compare the two. But notice we get a definite date of around 1250. And then that date coincides with the reign of Ramses II. So we can see the implications for these different dates and how they line up with other regions and what's going on in those other regions. The other thing you'll notice about the critical scheme is that there are far fewer items. Critical scholars aren't going to date all of the events in David's life, for example. A conservative scholar will go ahead and give a best approximation of the events in David's life based on the dates that are given for David's life. So anyway, that's how we represent these two sort of broad stroke dating schemes. And then the next question is, well, what are our sources for each of these schemes? And to see that, you can go into the help and go into Accordance Help. And then if you look under Timeline, you'll get the timeline dates. And it will talk about, understanding the conservative versus critical dates. And then it'll also give you the timeline date scheme sources. And so I can expand that and I can see, all right, well, the conservative dates for the Old Testament come from Eugene Merrill's Kingdom of Priests, which I'm very excited that we now have on Accordance. And then for Old Testament writings, you have Gleason Archer's Survey of Old Testament Introduction. For the intertestamental period, we used a couple of different sources. For the New Testament, we used dates given to us by Harold Hohner of Dallas Theological Seminary. For the critical dates, we used Jack Finnegan for the Old and New Testament periods, and HarperCollins Bible Dictionary for the Old Testament prophets and writings, and so on. So, and then for other dates, extra biblical dates, for example, most of them come from the Cambridge Ancient History, and so on. Okay, so that's where we get the dates from. So if we go to David's adultery with Bathsheba, if you want to find out Eugene Merrill's arguments for that, well, I'll tell you what, I'm going to do what you should never do in a demo. I joke that doing a demonstration or teaching a webinar is a bit like being a lawyer. You never want to ask a question you don't already know the answer to. In a demo, you don't ever want to do something that you don't already know is going to work, but I'm going to try this. We've got the phrase David's adultery with Bathsheba, and I'm going to go to the Amplify menu and go to Eugene Merrill's Kingdom of Priests and see if I can amplify to that. And unfortunately I can't, because those words don't actually appear in Merrill in that order, but I could do something like this: click on the scripture link, find the name Bathsheba in the scripture text, and then go to Eugene Merrill's Kingdom of Priests. And that ought to give us the information about the chronology of this particular story. And so here it goes into chronological considerations, and you can read his article about, well, essentially what it boils down to is that this had to take place around the time of the war with Ammon, which is the war that's going on at the time of the story. And so he dates the war with Ammon and then goes from there to dating this particular episode in David's life. All right, does that make sense to everybody? I've talked a fair amount about dates and sources, but I want you to be aware of what's behind all this. Any questions? All right. Well, let me show you just a couple of other things. Let's do my favorite feature of the timeline. When looking at the timeline, you've got the date bar that actually gives you the years right here above all the events and everything. And one of the things you'll notice when I hover over the date bar, I get my cursor changing from an arrow to a magnifying glass. Whenever you see that, you're dealing with something that can be clicked on to link to more information. So whenever you see that magnifying glass in your cursor, try clicking to see what you're going to get. And so if I were to go above David's adultery with Bathsheba, about that point in the timeline, and click in the date bar, Accordance will open up a window that will list everything that I have on the timeline in a text format broken down by the various regions. And I can see everything that's going on the timeline during that particular period. Okay, that's if I just click to get a single year. If I click and drag, I can actually get a range of years. So what I'm going to do here is scroll up so David's life is right next to the time bar here. And I'm just going to follow along. So a little before 1040 and then to around 970, that's the period of David's life. Once I've selected the time period I want information about, I'll just let go of the mouse button. And it's like clicking on a selection. And so this gives me a wider range of years and more information to look at. And so here we can see during the period of David's life, in Rome, the Latins are just beginning to settle in Italy. In Greece, you're in the Dark Age between the earlier Mycenaean culture and the later classical Greek period that most of us are more familiar with. And then in Asia Minor, you have a series of Neo-Hittite states. This is after the fall of the Hittite Empire. And so you have all of these little smaller states sort of filling in the power vacuum that's left. And at the same time, you have the Assyrians in the later part of this period starting to move into Asia Minor and conquer some of these Neo-Hittite states. And then on the west coast of Turkey, you have the Ionian Greek city-states being founded. In Persia, you're in the late Elamite period. In Mesopotamia, Assyria is in decline for much of this period. And these are the Assyrian rulers that were ruling at the time. In Syria, you have these other little kingdoms like Zobah, and then David goes to war with them, and then during the latter part of his life, they are occupying the area of Aram and so on. And then you have struggles with the Philistines. This is the Phoenicians are struggling with the Philistines and expanding to other, starting their mercantile colonies and so on. And these are the Phoenician rulers. And then in Israel, you've got the events of David's life, and in Egypt, you're in the third intermediate period. So another period of weakness and relative, decentralization. And so one of the interesting things that we see from this is that during the period of David's life, all of the major world powers are in a period of decline and disarray. The Greeks are in a dark age. In Asia Minor, you've got, this is after the fall of the Hittite Empire, Assyria is weak, and Egypt is weak. And so David is able to expand his little empire and become the dominant force in the region precisely because all of these major world powers are weak, and he doesn't have to deal with, much stronger nations keeping him in check. And so he's basically filling the power vacuum. So again, these are the kinds of synchronisms that you can see with the timelines. Very interesting to be able to explore these kinds of things. Any questions on that feature? Again, to get it, you just click or click and drag and then let go. And it will open up that timeline data window. And it'll show you whatever is on the timeline. So for example, this timeline data window is not showing me profits or writings because those items I've taken off. I've got rulers, individuals, and events chosen. If I had all items chosen, it would show me even more information. Any questions?
Dennis, do you have a question?
Yes, in that side window there, the printed out version of the timeline, is that printable?
Sure.
How so?
I believe you just choose print.
Oh, with the cursor in that window, just choose print. Okay, yeah,
Right.
okay. Well,
Yeah, you've
good.
got to make sure that particular zone is selected. Otherwise, it'll try to print the timeline, I guess.
Thank you.
All right. That covers most of the features of the timeline. There's more to the timeline even than this. You can, of course, search. I did show you searching for the Exodus, but you can click the little find button and search for any particular item. You can actually create your own custom items. So if you are convinced that both the conservative date of the Exodus and the critical date of the Exodus are completely wrong, you can go ahead and create your own date for the Exodus and then remove our Exodus from being seen so that you show your Exodus and so on. That's a subject for another webinar, we haven't done that one in a while, Linda, but maybe we need to do the customizing the timeline at some point.